Hi Unwrappers, Ollie here. Just so you know, the first story in this week's episode is about mental health and trauma and includes multiple references to suicide. For support, check the show notes. It's the week ending Saturday the 12th of February and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days we've seen the Queen making history as the first British monarch to reach 70 years on the throne, West Ham Football Club fining their defender Kurt Zouma £250,000 for animal cruelty, and Adele taking home Best Artist, Best Album and Song at the Brits. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Jo Evans and Kate Samuelson. And back for her third appearance, I think that's what they call in your line of work, Emma, a hat trick. It is news editor at Goal, Emma Smith. Okay, Jo, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the army waking up to the hidden cost of war?
We've gone from not really doing anything to now being it's so important. And it was really nice that you could talk about your experience as a whole rather than just sit there on your own. And now we can properly deal with the horrible things that you do have to deal with, because it's all part and parcel of being in the army, and that's why you join, because you want to look after people and their worst days, and you want to be able to treat them and kind of work it out together, because that's what the army's about, looking out for each other and making sure that your mate's okay.
A video uploaded by the British Army for World Mental Health Day in 2021. Jo, what's happened this week?
Two stories have really caught my eye this week. The first was reported in the local press in Northampton and told the story of a former soldier who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who was left so crippled by PTSD on his return that even his baby's cries were triggering panic attacks, and he was actually driven to feeling suicidal. The second was a story that was in The Mirror about a soldier who took his own life, unfortunately, having served in Afghanistan. His parents then reached out to the MOD to try and replace some of his lost medals that he received while serving in the British Army, and they were told that they could only be replaced by fakes. The two stories kind of come hot on the heels of the MOD last year announcing that for the first time ever they're going to start recording veteran suicides in England and Wales. And I just thought the combination of the three stories kind of brought home a sense that, first of all, mental health in the armed forces and particularly suicide in the armed forces haven't really been dealt with particularly well in Britain historically, and also sort of raised the question of whether we are sort of slowly beginning to wake up to the impact of a military mental health crisis.
Okay, so how is this actually manifesting for these guys? Because I think a lot of us think we know what PTSD is. We know it stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. We get the idea, you have a traumatic event in your life and then it repeats on you, basically. But what's the reality of what's happening for these people?
So the gentleman from Northampton who served 2 tours in Afghanistan has a kind of frighteningly common story, really. He served his 2 terms, was seemingly fine, and then came home to the United Kingdom and slowly saw his mental health deteriorate over a period of time. This issue with PTSD and the difficulty that the military has with aftercare has really strikingly come through in some reporting by the Times' Anthony Lloyd. He tracked members of the 2 Rifles, which is an infantry regiment in the British Army that was formed in the early 2000s. 55 soldiers from that regiment died during the campaign in Afghanistan, and 22 have took their lives since they came home. Many of these people are suffering with what you've just said, Ollie, PTSD. In layman's terms, PTSD is a reliving of traumatic events, whether that's through nightmares, through flashbacks. The debate over where it comes from is a sort of continuing area of medical science. But essentially what most psychological experts describe it as is a sort of brain glitch, where during a moment of extreme trauma, people misfile the event rather than laying it down as a memory, which means that it can quite often be triggered by things in the present, despite the fact that it is something that should have been filed as something that has previously happened to you. In other words, it remains a very present, active element of your mental well-being, as opposed to something that you would file as a trauma that's passed.
And Emma, as we heard in that YouTube clip, the Army these days are at pains to point out that they do offer support for mental health that simply was not there decades ago. But do you think it's enough?
I think that it's a good thing, as Jo mentioned, that the Army is going to start keeping track of suicide deaths among soldiers, so that this issue can be properly dealt with. And I think it's important that they would also keep track of instances such that after soldiers have left the army, because then that would also help track of how big an issue PTSD is. And I think that organisations that can help soldiers with PTSD should be actively promoted by the army while they're serving, so that they know what to turn to if this becomes an issue after serving, and also that their families know who they can turn to.
Yeah, but that is more about aftercare, maybe, Kate. I mean, Emma was saying there that the army need to more heavily promote these services whilst people are serving, but there's an obvious reason why they don't do that, isn't there? Which is you need your army to remain focused on being an unquestioning unit, strategically working together with physical force, not thinking about themselves and their needs. I mean, that's basically it, is that you mentally break people down so that they can serve in the army. That's why these things aren't actively promoted much during people's service, isn't it?
I think that there's a big difference between people signing up for the army and having an expectation of what's going to be coming, and then actually being in the army and having to do the things that they're doing. I know that, well, it's my understanding that you have to pass various psychological assessments to join, but just like physical fitness, your mental health isn't a static thing, and you know it can change depending on the kind of situations that you're exposed to. And I think it's also worth noting that recent wars that soldiers have been involved with are pretty different to historic ones in terms of the kind of risks that soldiers are facing. Terrorism and terrorist attacks are now a kind of major thing that members of the army have to think about when they go off to fight. And the atmosphere of fear that these kind of randomised or seemingly randomised attacks can create among service members, you know, that's been quoted as being a huge impact on people's mental health because of it puts people on constant edge.
And Joe, you and I discussed on the show back in 2020 the army dabbling in mindfulness courses, for which they were criticised in some quarters, mental health and well-being not being their core business. If they did more of it, if they actually provided more support and more care, who's to say they'd do it well anyway?
Well, the issue, I think, at the moment, and the issue that comes through in Anthony Lloyd's reporting in the Times, is that many troops have a major issue finding help when they leave the armed forces, because it's simply quite difficult to talk to a civilian about the kind of experiences that they've had. One of the people in Anthony Lloyd's reporting talks about how they went to see a civilian psychologist who very quickly told them that they were simply just not qualified to deal with the levels of trauma that they'd experienced. And it really comes through in some of the kind of case studies that you have. Andrew Francis, who served in the Two Rifles and the group of soldiers that I referred to earlier, when he left the army, a sort of cursory look at his service record should really have highlighted that he was potentially a vulnerable person. He was very young, he was exposed to multiple combat traumas, he'd experienced what is referred to as moral injury, in that he felt that he may have possibly killed a non-combatant during his time in Afghanistan. And so it's striking really that the issue here is that soldiers are finding it incredibly difficult to lean on the types of mental health support that civilians can lean on, because most civilians are never exposed to this level of trauma. To go back to your point about the sort of the way the army has previously dabbled in this kind of thing, I think what's really striking here is it all does feel like a huge abdication of duty that the British Army and the British state really doesn't look after these veterans in the way that we should. And you know, something as obvious as not recording veteran suicides is quite striking when compared to our allies, where these figures are recorded. If you look at somewhere like America, there's a dedicated Washington department that records these figures, and they found that between 2001 and 2016, the suicide rate in veterans increased by 35%. Now, that's staggering, and if that is true, if we were to look at the data in the UK and find figures like that, I think it would really bring home the carelessness, really, with which we're dealing with aftercare.
Yes, I mean, the statistic that struck me, Kate, was the Costs of War project at Brown University, which revealed that an estimated 30,177 serving US soldiers and veterans involved in operations since 9/11 had taken their own lives, compared with the 7,057 killed in action during the same period. It's actually a bigger cost to people's mental health than their physical health serving in the US Army.
Yeah, I was really shocked to read that statistic as well. And also the statistic that veteran suicides made up around 14% of all suicides in America in 2018. I think it's interesting that America does do this reporting, and I think it's definitely an important step that the government has decided to start recording this data from next year, but it is quite shocking to think that they haven't recorded it so far, and perhaps it's just criticism spurring it on that's made the government decide to kind of start recording this data now. It was only in the most recent census last year that the government included a question about previous service in the armed forces, meaning that before that we didn't really have any sense of kind of all the veterans living in the UK and numbers and things like that. And I think it's quite telling that all the data that we have at the moment about veteran suicides have come from independent organisations. Like there's a group called Veterans United Against Suicide, and they've been undertaking these unofficial counts for the last 3 or 4 years. And when you look at the reporting online about suicide in the British Army and the stats, often it's these unofficial groups which big news sites are quoting because the information is just not out there.
But there are lots of those groups, Emma. I mean, this is something else that struck me from Anthony Lloyd's article in the Times. Quote, "In theory, there is no shortage of services to help veterans. More than 1,800 registered veterans charities exist in the UK, many professing to offer mental health treatment with an annual income of more than £1 billion. So you have to ask why it is that soldiers aren't always turning to the services that are supposedly offered. Is there still an element of classic army mentality, basically, bravado, getting on with it, even when you're in that situation of crisis?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there are plenty of fantastic organisations, things like Help for Heroes, Walking with the Wounded, Combat Stress and others who do great work. But I think that there may be something in the sort of the masculinity or traditional keep calm and carry on aspect of the army. I've never served in the armed forces, but I do have a family member who served in Afghanistan in the early 2010s, and their reaction and their attitudes was, you join the army, you know what you're getting in for, you know the stresses that you're likely to be placed under. But that doesn't mean that the army doesn't have proper duty of care and proper duty of aftercare to its soldiers, to the people who work for it. And if there is a element of soldiers not wanting to seek care, too proud, too afraid to sort of look weak or whatever it might be, I think it's up to the army to remove that stigma and to make sure that they are taking proper care, because the fact is that the stats, while they may not be recorded by the army, they are being recorded by these organisations, and they are shocking.
Joe, what is the cure for PTSD though? Is there one? I'm choosing my words carefully because obviously I don't want someone listening to this who's experiencing these feelings to feel that it's pointless them seeking help. Obviously, we want you to go and get help, and there is help available, as we've said, if you're in this situation. But with help available and these suicides still happening, is it just that PTSD is a very difficult nut to crack for a lot of people?
It is immensely complicated, and one of the most common forms of therapy offered to people that suffer from PTSD is cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a very similar kind of therapy to the type that is recommended by the NHS for all manner of things. If you were to go to your doctor with an anxiety-related issue, they would likely also recommend CBT. The issue being that having this sort of one-size-fits-all approach to these things is very difficult, especially when you consider the reaction of a civilian psychotherapist to the individual that Anthony Lloyd spoke to. It's also true to say that military mental health issues are quite often exacerbated by a concept that's referred to as moral injury that I referred to earlier. This is something that most people won't ever suffer in their lives because it's a damage done to a person's conscience, essentially, or their moral compass when they have to perpetuate or witness acts that they feel transgress against their moral beliefs. That unsurprisingly is a very real possibility in a war zone. It could be anything. It could be the use of deadly force, or it could be inadvertently injuring or killing non-combatants. It's notable, actually, that one of the things that leading mental health charities talk about, specifically in relation to the military and moral injury, is returning home from deployment and hearing of executions of cooperating local nationals or a deterioration in the situation on the ground where you once were. When you then think about, for example, the amount of former servicemen and women who now serve in the House of Commons following the withdrawal of NATO and US troops from Afghanistan, they were incredibly vocal about the need to support those on the ground, and often would refer to the fact that this was going to have an exacerbating impact on the existing mental health issues that lots of former members of the armed service have. And so this is another complication on top of the sort of traditional understanding we have of PTSD in terms of unpicking veterans' mental health issues when they return home.
Kate, what do you think should happen next?
As we've discussed just now, there are loads of amazing organisations and charities that are offering support, and even the NHS itself is doing a lot of great work. They've recently launched a new mental health service for veterans called Op Courage, and the service is expected to treat around 500 people a year, focusing mainly on people who are at risk from self-harm and suicide. And what's interesting about this is that everyone at Op Courage is either from the armed forces community or has experience in working with people who have served in the army. And that's, as we've discussed, that's really important for people who have experienced what they've experienced to then have support from people who actually understand what they've been through. We have around 2.4 million veterans living in this country, and that around 1 in 20 of them are suffering from PTSD, and there's not better support out there. These people give their lives for our country. They experience things that we can't even imagine in our wildest nightmares often, and I think it's really important that this mental health crisis specific to the army is one that's being spoken about and taken really seriously.
Agreed. Okay, Emma, you're next after this. Right, Emma, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is English football's problem with crowd trouble getting worse?
Earlier there was an altercation when a fan ran onto the pitch whilst the Forest players celebrated their third goal. That came in the 32nd minute of the game. The club have confirmed that a man has been arrested and is in police custody.
Mark Chapman reporting for BBC Sport on Sunday. Emma, what's the story?
So this was an incident during Sunday's FA Cup fourth-round match between Nottingham Forest and Leicester City. After Nottingham Forest scored a goal, a Leicester fan ran onto the pitch and attacked the Nottingham Forest players.
Attacked how?
Attempted to punch and kick fans who were celebrating near the Leicester fans. One of them ran onto the pitch and attempted to confront the Forest players. And it comes amid a spate of recent pitch invasions in football, both in England and in Europe. And it comes following a report published on BBC Sport at the end of January, which shows that the number of football-related arrests and disorder incidents at football grounds are at their highest level in several years.
Do you detect that when you go to football grounds and watch matches, or even when you're just, watching a lot more live feeds of football than the rest of us do as part of your job? Do you detect that the atmosphere has intensified?
It has become notable. Some of the pitch invasions have been less sinister than this. For example, both Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi have been targeted by people looking for selfies while after matches. There was also an incident during a Women's Super League game where a fan ran onto the pitch, attempted to take selfies, and was body checked by Chelsea's Sam Kerr.
And one of the concerns in the 70s and 80s, Kate, as a result of which there was legislation, was people drinking in view of the pitch. In fact, they're talking about reversing that now, aren't they? But leaving that to one side. What I've noticed in the coverage now is that it doesn't seem to be so much about alcohol, but cocaine.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there are a few factors that people think have led to this rise in disruptive, disorderly behaviour at football matches, and cocaine taking is definitely one of them. That's thought to have played a really key role in the disorder at the Euros 2020 final last year. Reports suggested that lots of the members of the mob which stormed Wembley Stadium were high on cocaine. And a survey last summer actually revealed that more than 30% of fans have witnessed cocaine being taken inside a football stadium, and actually 6% have admitted to personal cocaine use. The number is probably actually slightly higher than that, I would guess. And data shows that there's been a big rise in the number of arrests relating to cocaine and other drug use too. And the head of football policing is actually saying that drug users should be punished with a ban from all games whatsoever if they're caught taking or with drugs on them. But at the same time, I think, cocaine is a problem in wider society at the moment, this kind of rise in cocaine taking and the behaviour that users can perpetuate as a result of taking cocaine, that's something that's not unique to football, and perhaps it's a slight kind of moral panic, this idea that cocaine and football are so intrinsically linked, and we actually need to be looking at the impact that the huge amount of cocaine use in society is having on society at the moment, full stop, not just in the world of football.
Joe, what do you think is motivating this increase in pitch invasions?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? And there's a lot of sort of pop psychology surrounding it, I think. One of the most common things that has been suggested as being a factor in it is just a sort of post-lockdown effect. Lots of people have been sort of locked away in their houses for such a long time, and that they haven't really had an opportunity to engage in sort of mob mentality or mob behaviour, and that what's essentially happening is people are letting their hair down. I'm slightly sceptical of the extent to which I think that's the case, and that also does to me sort of sound slightly, moral panic-y, as Kate just suggested, in the same way that there was a panic that everyone was going to go out and be drunk for 2 months straight when the pubs reopened, which sort of didn't come to be. I can't really put a finger on what it is that's driving this stuff, but it certainly does feel, I've been attending football matches now for most of my adult life, and it certainly does.
Who do you support?
I support Wolves. I'm a Wolverhampton Wanderers fan.
Okay, and is the behaviour immaculate there?
There was a very strange occurrence actually after a football match recently where Norwich fans accused the Wolves fans of assaulting them, and that the West Midlands Police said they hadn't received a single actual report of an assault, which was a very odd little occurrence. This is a slight side note. It certainly does feel, though, that the atmosphere around football stadiums has become sort of increasingly febrile and slightly hostile in the last sort of 12 months. That's not to say that I've never found myself in hostile situations at football grounds before, but it certainly does feel like it is a rising problem.
I mean, what are the consequences, Emma, for the game itself of pitch invasions? I mean, leaving aside, actual physical violence, but when that hasn't happened, if someone's just disrupting the game, what's the issue for the clubs?
I suppose the primary is the PR element, the fact that it's, for people who are slightly older, it's seeing these instances of disorder brings back memories of the bad old days of the 70s and 80s, when hooliganism was rife and was an issue. And I think that looking at the stats from the report, the 759 instances of disorder so far in the 2021-22 season, with 210 of those involving people under 25, for who the hooliganism of the 70s and 80s is now sort of being almost rose-tinted and glorified and sort of part of the football casual culture, and what we sort of deem toxic masculinity, but which is part of how some young fans feel they should behave at matches, and is part of their culture. The fact is that if that goes unchecked and becomes more pervasive, it's going to put off what I think you would call the vast majority of people who want to go to a football match, in order to enjoy the game. And if it becomes a case where you've got a load of lads behaving aggressively, looking for fights, whether or not, just because they're playing at hooliganism, or because they've got a real, or if they really have intentions of being aggressive, then that is going to put people off, and that's going to, in the end, impact the wallets of the football clubs if they're getting less and less people coming in. And the fact is that even if there is playing at hooliganism, that can escalate, as we saw at the Euro final.
It's not just the supporters behaving badly, though, is it, Kate? I mean, you only have to look at the headlines, and we have Mason Greenwood arrested on suspicion of sexual assault. We have Kurt Zuma having his pets taken away by the RSPCA because he physically hurt them. Is there an element, do you think, of trickle-down behaviour, of what's acceptable coming from the players too?
I think that's an interesting point. There's definitely a big issue with culture in the game as a whole. I know that in an independent review that was issued last month by Baroness Casey, she said that the culture around football matches is the biggest challenge in tackling behaviour. And it's it's not new information to say that there's been links between domestic violence in football matches and high levels of misogyny among football fans. A study that was published earlier this year found that 86% of football fans polled thought that women should not participate in sport at all, and it showed that 2/3 of male football fans hold sexist views. It shows that it really is a cultural issue, and whether that stems from the top, I'm not sure, but I would imagine that the actions of the major players does play a big part in influencing, and it does trickle down to the fans.
And Emma, finally, what do you say to people who put the kind of classic question to you, which is, why does this only happen in football? I mean, maybe that's not entirely true, but the perception of kind of layman is this doesn't happen in cricket, doesn't happen in rugby, certainly doesn't happen with people supporting, American sports, baseball or basketball when they're in the UK. It doesn't happen with athletics. Why does it only happen in football?
I think because football has this, it's a traditionally working class sport, it's traditionally male sport, and therefore it attracts, I suppose, people who see themselves as traditional in that respect. And in that traditional viewpoint can manifest itself as over the top sort of aggressive masculinity. And to an extent, I think that a lot of the people who engage in these sort of disorder and the rest are sort of raging against the dying of the light and realising that their viewpoint and their views on masculinity are not accepted in almost anywhere else in society. And the only place where they can act like this now is at football grounds, when they're one of the crowd, when they can, get boozed up, drugged up, and act like this. And it's only acceptable in football grounds, in among certain football fandoms. There needs to be more work done because of the fact that it simply isn't acceptable at any football grounds or anywhere else.
Well, talking about the dying of the light, we do only have one story left, but it's worth sticking around for, and it's coming from Kate after this. Kate, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Will 2022 be the year of the potato?
Just poured it in the glass, and the first thing that I've noticed on is how creamy it is, and it's got little white bits in. Let's hope that's not potato, but if it is, let's roll with it. Actually a lot better than I was expecting. I'm kind of relieved. It doesn't taste like potatoes at all. It's very, very, very creamy and kind of fatty, but in a good way, although this is the barista version, not the unsweetened or the original, because they might be different. It kind of has a malty taste. A lot of people have said it has a salty flavour to it. I'm actually not picking on that at all. It's malty, not salty. Okay, it actually kind of tastes like white chocolate. I'm actually say this is on par with oat milk, if not a little bit better.
Eliza Pitkin from the Big Issues TikTok channel. What is the story, Kate? What was she drinking?
So she's drinking Swedish potato milk from a brand called Doug. It's a Swedish brand, so I'm not 100% sure whether I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. But Doug went on sale this week in 220 Waitrose stores, costing £1.80 a carton. And Doug is the first potato milk to hit the UK. It's vegan friendly, it's free from common allergens like lactose, gluten and nuts. And as you heard, it's described as being deliciously creamy, and it's also able to make a great foam in coffee.
Now, it sounds sort of ridiculous, potato milk, and we'll go into the detail of that in a moment. But this is big business, the alternative milk sector, isn't it? It's not a laughing matter these days when you have the likes of Oatly making just huge turnovers, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's well known that UK sales of plant-based milk are booming, to use a very tabloid term, and the British market is worth about 400 million a year, according to Forbes. A survey by the market research firm Minter that was conducted about a year ago found that the UK's use of plant-based milk is at an all-time high, and actually, probably unsurprisingly, its highest use is among millennials, and around 44% of millennials actually drink plant-based milk. But I think it's worth noting that cow's milk or dairy milk is still or milk, if you
as you might call it,
or milk as you might call it. It's still a far, far bigger market, worth more than 3 billion, and I don't think potato milk is going to overtake that anytime soon, considering it only accounts for about 0.2% of all plant milks at the moment.
Joe, what is the PR message that Doug are sending? Why should you buy potato milk rather than oat milk?
So the pitch is that obviously the dairy process is incredibly bad for the environment, in that it requires farming cows. Cows emit methane, all the stories people have heard before, no doubt. The claim of Doug is that because potatoes use less water to grow than things like oats and nuts, that it's more sustainable even than almond milk or other types of milk. Oatly's milk is an example of that. So yeah, their claim is that it's super sustainable, not just sustainable like those other options.
You've got to watch their claims that these companies make, though, haven't you, Emma? You know, a lot of these companies have had raps on the knuckles for the way they've promoted their products of late.
Oatly recently had an advertising campaign banned in the UK by the Advertising Standards Authority, who said that they'd overstated how environmentally friendly their processes were. Certainly, Doug's processes do look to be very green. They've worked with Carbon Cloud, a firm that calculates the climate footprint of foods, that show that growing potatoes is twice as efficient as oats and the crops use less water. While it is advertising and it is PR and it has to be taken with a certain pinch of salt, it does look as though these are more environmentally friendly alternatives to traditional dairy milk.
Yeah, a pinch of salt and some calcium carbonate, Kate, and some emulsifier from sunflower lecithin. Because the ingredients of this stuff aren't as nutritious as the word milk might imply, are they?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's worth noting that only about 6 to 9% of potato milk actually contains potatoes. It's
6%?
Mainly water. Yeah, 6 to 9%. It's mainly water. I mean, potato milk's made in a very similar way to other plant-based milks like oats and almonds, where it's strained and then combined with water alongside other kind of mysterious ingredients like the ones you listed earlier, like pea protein and rapeseed oil. Some also contain a lot of added sugars.
Yeah, well, including this Doug potato milk, I've got the ingredients here: rapeseed oil, fructose, sucrose, acidity regulators, etc.
Yeah, they're not exactly the nicest ingredients, but I think what's most significant is that plant milk does not contain as much protein as dairy milk, and that's sometimes where problems arise. People who don't consume any dairy can end up becoming more at risk of things like weak bones and osteoporosis and potentially fractures later in life. And it's actually, interestingly, young women in particular who are most at risk of these kind of nutritional shortfalls and need to take care when not consuming dairy and making sure that they're getting their vitamins and minerals in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting campaigns that Oatly did, which they did get in trouble for, didn't they, Joe, as well, was when they had that big billboard that said milk but for humans, the implication being that we all drink, or we did all drink cow's milk, as if that's a thing we're sort of designed, quote unquote, to be drinking, but actually it's calves that are supposed to be drinking cow's milk, not humans. But then what's the alternative, really? This is a substitute, but an alternative might be water, like have black coffee. Why would you put rapeseed oil in it?
Yeah, milk to me sort of is something that should be filed in this sort of category of things that we've decided are not hugely good for you, but are actually sort of demonstrably fine. Like it's one of these things that we've now decided is sort of incredibly harmful, and you know, our ancestors have drunk this stuff for hundreds of years. We shouldn't be living to 110, but we've all been drinking milk, so we've been dying in our mid-80s. You know, it is demonstrably fine, and it is good for you. I can't say that I'll be swapping to potato milk. Listeners will not have got to see the look on the lady's face in that clip at the beginning, which far be it to me to cast aspersions against anyone else's reporting, but the look on her face didn't quite square with her description of how delicious it was. And so I think I probably will be sticking to cow's milk or as you say, Ollie, milk for the short term at least, because I am slightly sceptical of some of the claims that these things that are sort of pumped full of, as you say, slightly odd-sounding things like pea proteins and rapeseed oil are particularly sort of nutritionally valuable. And so I'm not hugely convinced by a lot of the claims that these companies make.
I just wonder as well, Emma, whether a lot of households are like mine, where my wife buys oat milk because she genuinely likes the taste. It's not out of environmental concern. She likes the taste. She's maybe bought some of the Kool-Aid that Joe's talking about there, that, you know, it's somehow better for you. And so what we have in our fridge is a whole milk for the kids, skimmed milk for me, and oat milk for my wife. So we haven't really cut down on milk. We've got 3 different things that we put in drinks. It's, you know, it's not really cutting down on our milk consumption. It's just another product you buy.
A 3 milk household. Like
Yeah.
new equipment.
Yeah.
3-car household or 2-car. And also, what Joe mentioned the clip earlier. One thing she talks about how it tastes of white chocolate and this and that, and crucially, the thing that she didn't say it tastes of is milk, which I found quite interesting. I think that it's going to be one of those things that isn't going to have the immediate cut through that the brands would like to have you believe. That the idea that in 2022 by the end of 2022 we will all be drinking potato milk or oat milk. I think it's going to take a lot longer to cut through. I think that the biggest issue really is the PR hurdle. Ask any person on the street, would you drink potato milk? They'd just give you a very, very funny look, I think.
Except Kate, Waitrose obviously feel that's changing, don't they? They have backed this product and put it in all their stores. They've put out this big press release that everyone has reported on, which is why you noticed it. What are the other food trends that you think might be round the corner for 2022?
Yeah, you're right. So Waitrose is definitely behind the year of the potato, but they have also talked about some other big trends. That includes yuzu, which is a tangerine-sized citrus fruit that's cultivated in Asia, and it has this kind of lemony, grapefruity, limey flavour. Waitrose thinks that that's going to start appearing on all our shelves in different forms of condiments like yuzu mustard, and also in hard seltzers as well, which was a big trend last year. Hibiscus as well, as in the flower, that's another big trend for 2022. We're going to start seeing hibiscus yogurts, hibiscus soft drinks, cocktails and more, apparently. Another big trend, at least according to my inbox, because I must have had hundreds of press releases about this, is CBD-infused food and drink. CBD has been a big trend for a while, but we haven't really seen it in what we're eating. We've had it in beauty products last year, but now it's going to be in our food, apparently. So that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, well, with the sobering thought of pouring cannabis milk into my mashed potato by the end of the year, I will leave it there. Thank you to our top spuds, Kate, Emma and Joe. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have found us today via a Spotify playlist, then tap Go to Podcast and then tap Follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.